Congress moved quickly, almost unanimously. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed with overwhelming support. It granted the president authority to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression. No formal declaration of war, but power, expansive power, was placed in the hands of the executive branch. And here's where the tension deepens. Even as the resolution passed, doubts were circulating behind closed doors. Naval officers questioned the second attack. Some reports suggested that radar images may have been misread. Sonar signals could have been caused by rough waters. Intercepted communications were ambiguous. In private messages, confusion appeared in real time. Freak weather effects, almost total darkness, overeager sonar operators. Those words existed, but they did not lead the headlines. The American people heard certainty, clarity, confidence. What they did not hear was uncertainty. And in moments of national tension, the version of events that reaches the public first often becomes the permanent one. Airstrikes followed. Operation Pierce Arrow. American aircraft hit North Vietnamese targets within days. The conflict escalated, not gradually, not cautiously, but decisively. The Gulf of Tonkin became more than an incident. It became justification. Years later, declassified documents and internal communications would paint a more complicated picture. The first attack, real. The second, deeply questionable. Some historians argue it never happened at all. Others suggest misinterpretation rather than fabrication. But the result was the same. A moment of ambiguity turned into a mandate for war. Here's the uncomfortable question. Did fear amplify uncertainty into certainty? Because once Congress authorized force, there was no easy way back. Advisors became combat troops. Limited strikes became sustained bombing campaigns. What was presented as response turned into escalation. And most Americans supported it at first. They believed their country had been attacked. They believed the response was necessary. They believed leadership was acting on solid information. But imagine the weight of that second night. Blips on a radar screen. Sound waves in dark water. Young sailors at their stations. Officials in Washington making decisions before dawn. History pivoting on interpretation. In the Cold War atmosphere, where hesitation felt dangerous, ambiguity could not be allowed to linger. It had to become clarity. And clarity demanded action. The Gulf of Tonkin wasn't just an incident in distant waters. It was the spark. A spark that lit a conflict that would reshape America. And it all hinged on one question that still echoes. What really happened in the dark that night? Keycap 3. The pressure behind closed doors. In public, the message was steady. Firm voice. Clear posture. Controlled confidence. America had been attacked. America would respond. But behind closed doors, the tone was different. The year was 1964. An election year. President Lyndon B. Johnson was not just managing foreign policy. He was managing perception. The Cold War had created a political reality in Washington. No president wanted to appear weak on communism. Weakness could cost credibility, and credibility could cost elections. Johnson had inherited Vietnam after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He did not start the involvement, but now it was his to manage, his to explain, his to own. Advisors filled the room. Military leaders, intelligence officials, political strategists. Some urged caution. They warned that Vietnam was complex, that the South Vietnamese government was unstable, that guerrilla warfare in jungle terrain would not resemble conventional battle. Others warned of something else. If America pulled back, what message would that send to Moscow? To Beijing? To allies in Europe? To every country measuring U.S. resolve? In the Cold War, every move was symbolic. Johnson understood the stakes. He had domestic priorities, civil rights, social programs, what he called the Great Society. A full-scale war could derail those ambitions, but appearing passive in the face of aggression could derail his presidency. And in private recordings, tapes that would surface years later, you can hear hesitation in his voice. He worried about getting trapped. He worried about sending young Americans into a conflict that might not be winnable. He worried about escalation, but he also worried about headlines, about political opponents accusing him of surrendering Southeast Asia, about being remembered as the president who lost Vietnam. Here's the tension. Sometimes leaders don't choose between good and bad. They choose between bad and worse. Inside those meetings, strategy mixed with politics, intelligence mixed with instinct. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution had given Johnson broad authority. Now the question wasn't whether he could escalate. It was whether he should. Military commanders requested more troops, more air power, more aggressive engagement. They believed pressure could break North Vietnam's will. Civilian advisors debated timelines, costs, public opinion. And through it all, one belief persisted. Once America commits, it cannot retreat, because retreat invites challenge. But here's what the American public did not see: the uncertainty, the internal disagreements, the private doubts that did not match the public speeches. On television, the message was controlled, calm, assured. The administration emphasized limited objectives. No talk of endless war. No suggestion of open-ended commitment. Yet troop numbers began to rise. Advisors became combat forces. Bombing campaigns expanded. What was framed as temporary became sustained. And step by step, escalation became momentum. The machinery of war, once moving, is difficult to slow. Every additional deployment made withdrawal more complicated. Every casualty deepened commitment. Every speech defending action made reversal politically harder. Johnson faced a brutal equation: escalate and risk long-term entanglement, or hesitate and risk being labeled weak in the middle of the Cold War. And in 1960s America, that label carried real weight. This was not a moment of dramatic villainy. It was something more subtle, more human. Pressure. Pressure from generals who believed in military solutions. Pressure from advisors who feared global consequences. Pressure from political rivals waiting for an opening. Pressure from history itself. The decision to escalate Vietnam did not happen in a single explosive meeting. It unfolded gradually, quietly, through memos, briefings, incremental approvals, and each small decision felt manageable until they weren't. Because once the United States crossed a certain threshold, Vietnam stopped being advisory. It became war, and the American people, who had trusted that leadership had clarity, would soon begin to ask a different question. Were those decisions driven by necessity, or by fear of appearing weak? That question would not stay behind closed doors forever. Hashtag keycap for the escalation no one could contain. At first, the numbers were small. Advisors, trainers, specialists. Officially, they were not there to fight a war. They were there to help another country fight its own. That distinction mattered, politically, psychologically, publicly. But numbers have a way of changing meaning. By 1965, aircraft were striking targets deep in North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder began as pressure, limited, controlled, designed to send a message. The Cold War lie that led America to Vietnam. What if the war that divided America started with something that wasn't entirely true? In 1964, most Americans trusted what they were told. They believed their country had been attacked. They believed action was necessary. They believed it was about freedom. But decades later, documents would surface. Conversations would be revealed. And a different story would begin to emerge. This isn't just about Vietnam. It's about power, fear, and the Cold War mindset that shaped an entire generation. Today, we're breaking down the moment that changed everything. If you care about understanding the real turning points in American history, make sure you're subscribed. Before Vietnam became a battlefield, it was an idea shaped by fear. In the years after World War II, America did not feel invincible. It felt responsible. The United States had emerged stronger than any nation on Earth. Its economy was booming, its military unmatched, its influence global. But so was its rival. The Soviet Union was expanding its reach across Eastern Europe. Communist governments were forming behind what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. China had fallen to communism in 1949. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The Korean War followed, brutal, costly, unresolved. For many Americans, this wasn't a series of separate conflicts. It was a pattern, and patterns create fear. The belief that shaped Washington policy was simple and powerful. If one nation fell to communism, others would follow. Like dominoes, one after another, Southeast Asia was not just a region on a map. It was a line of standing tiles. If Vietnam fell, what would stop Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, the Philippines? And if Asia tilted toward Moscow or Beijing, what would that mean for American credibility? Because in the Cold War, perception was power. American leaders believed that showing weakness anywhere meant inviting challenge everywhere. The world was watching. Allies were watching. Enemies were watching. And every decision carried symbolic weight. Here's the tension. Vietnam, at that moment, was not yet a major American war. It was a former French colony struggling with its own civil conflict. Nationalism mixed with communism. Colonial wounds mixed with Cold War ideology. But in Washington, nuance disappeared. The conflict was filtered through one lens: containment. The United States had committed itself to stopping the spread of communism globally. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, Korea. Each step reinforced a single message: America would not retreat. And retreat became unthinkable. By the early 1960s, advisors were already on the ground in South Vietnam. Military aid was flowing. Presidents from both parties supported involvement. This was not a sudden decision. It was a slow tightening of a grip. Every report from Southeast Asia was read with the same underlying question: is this the next domino? And once fear frames the question, it often shapes the answer. For many Americans at home, the Cold War was real but distant. Ducking cover drills in schools. Nuclear anxiety in the background. Speeches about freedom and tyranny. It was a psychological standoff as much as a military one. But for policymakers, it felt immediate. They believed they were managing a global chessboard. And in chess, you don't sacrifice squares lightly, especially not ones positioned between major powers. There was another layer: credibility. After Korea ended in stalemate, American leaders worried about appearing indecisive. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba had embarrassed the Kennedy administration. Berlin was tense. The Cuban Missile Crisis had nearly brought the world to nuclear war. Each crisis reinforced a mindset: strength must be demonstrated. And Vietnam slowly transformed from a regional struggle into a test of American resolve. This is where the emotional core begins. Because once a nation defines a conflict as a test of credibility, backing down becomes more dangerous than moving forward. Even if the ground realities are unclear, even if the local politics are complicated, even if the public does not yet fully understand what is at stake. The Cold War did not just create enemies. It created urgency. And urgency compresses debate. By the time most Americans began paying attention to Vietnam, the framework had already been built. The assumptions were in place. The language was set. It was not about villages or jungles. It was about stopping something bigger. But here's the question that lingers. What if the fear of losing the world made leaders misread one country? What if Vietnam was less about global collapse and more about a regional revolution? That distinction would matter, because once fear defines the battlefield, facts struggle to compete. And America was about to face a moment where fear and fact would collide. It began with a report. Short, urgent, concerning. August 1964. The USS Maddox was operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. Officially, it was on a routine patrol. Unofficially, it was part of a broader intelligence effort, watching, listening, signaling presence. Tensions were already high. North Vietnam saw American ships near its coastline as provocation. The United States saw its presence as necessary deterrence. Two different interpretations. One narrow stretch of water. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese patrol boats approached the Maddox. Shots were fired. Torpedoes launched. The destroyer returned fire. Aircraft from the USS Ticonderoga responded. Washington received the message. American forces had been attacked. It was serious, but it was contained. Then came August 4th. Another report. Another alleged attack. Radar blips. Sonar readings. Fast-moving signals in the dark. Confusion over radio communications. The sea was rough. Weather unstable. Yet within hours, the conclusion forming in Washington was clear. The United States had been attacked again. Twice. President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation. His tone was firm, measured, determined. renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas. It sounded deliberate, direct, unprovoked, and in that moment, the American public felt something familiar, the instinct to defend. No one likes the idea of American sailors under fire. No one wants to appear passive in the face of aggression. The emotional impact was immediate. The message was simple: stop, or the cost increases. Instead, the cost increased for everyone. Troops arrived in larger waves. Marines landed at Da Nang. Soldiers stepped into heat that pressed against the lungs and terrain that erased distance. The jungle didn't behave like a battlefield. There were no clear front lines, no decisive cities to capture. You could secure an area by day and lose it by night. The enemy did not need to win battles, only to remain. For American soldiers, the mission felt clear at first: hold the line, protect villages, deny territory to communist forces. Many believed they were stopping a larger global threat, the same Cold War logic that had framed the conflict from the beginning. But reality on the ground was slower, harder to define. Patrols blurred into waiting. Waiting blurred into tension. Tension broke in seconds. Then silence returned. A war of moments rather than movements. Back home, the numbers appeared every evening. Troop levels rising. Casualty counts growing. Weeks turning into months. Months into years. And still, leaders spoke of progress. Search and destroy operations. Body counts as metrics. Maps colored to show control. The language of measurement tried to impose order on something resistant to order. Here's where the fracture begins. Because Americans had seen wars before. Wars with visible advances, front lines moving, surrender documents signed on ships. Vietnam looked different. Sounded different. Victory was always near, yet never arriving. Families listened to broadcasts at dinner tables. Letters traveled across the Pacific. Some carried reassurance. Others carried absence. Campuses began to question. Streets began to fill. Not everywhere, not all at once, but steadily. The war overseas was no longer distant from daily life at home. The draft intensified that connection. Young men who had grown up in post-war prosperity now faced a lottery that could send them into unfamiliar terrain under unfamiliar rules. Some accepted it as duty. Others struggled to understand the purpose. And the nation watched itself argue. Not quietly. Not briefly. The Cold War had once united Americans around a shared external tension. Vietnam redirected tension inward. Trust met doubt. Confidence met skepticism. Meanwhile, escalation continued. More troops meant more engagements. More engagements meant more losses. Each loss deepened commitment, because stopping after sacrifice felt unbearable to leaders who feared the meaning of withdrawal. So the logic looped. To justify what had already been invested, more had to be invested. Military commanders requested reinforcements to secure gains. Reinforcements required expanded operations. Expanded operations widened the war without resolving it. The battlefield consumed clarity. And here's the emotional weight. Many soldiers fought with extraordinary discipline and courage inside a strategy that struggled to define success. They carried out missions with precision, while policymakers searched for conclusions with certainty. Two different levels of war. One immediate, one abstract. Television brought the images into American living rooms. Not weeks later, but days later. Viewers saw terrain, exhaustion, helicopters lifting into humid air at sunrise. War was no longer described only by officials. It was witnessed. And witnessing changes perception. Because when a conflict has no visible end state, every escalation feels temporary, until it becomes permanent. By the late 1960s, Vietnam was no longer a limited response to an incident in distant waters. It was the central issue dividing a generation. And the question grew louder. How did a defensive reaction become an open-ended war? The answer lay not in one decision, but in the accumulation of many, each easier than reversal. Escalation had momentum, and momentum is hardest to stop when a nation has already committed its belief. Keycap 5: The truth that arrived too late. For years, Americans were told the war was necessary. Progress was being made. Pressure was working. Victory was possible. But behind debriefings and press conferences, a quieter record was being written. Internal memos, private assessments, intelligence reviews. doubts that did not match the certainty presented to the public. Then, in 1971, the silence cracked. The Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press. Thousands of pages. Classified studies commissioned by the Department of Defense. They revealed something unsettling, that multiple administrations had privately questioned the strategy, the metrics, even the likelihood of success, while publicly maintaining confidence. This wasn't just about military tactics. It was about trust. Americans reading those pages felt something shift. Not because war is simple, it never is, but because the distance between private doubt and public assurance had become undeniable. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, once described with clarity, looked more complicated in hindsight. Internal discussions had acknowledged uncertainty about the second attack. Yet that uncertainty never slowed the push for expanded authority. And the war had grown from there. Here's the emotional core. It wasn't that leaders faced hard decisions. Americans understand hard decisions. It was that the full picture hadn't been shared. In a democracy, trust is oxygen. When that oxygen thins, everything feels heavier. By the early 1970s, the war had already reshaped the country. Over 58,000 American service members had lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands carried physical and emotional scars home. Families were changed. Communities were changed. And now the narrative itself was changing. The release of the Pentagon Papers did not end the war overnight, but it altered the relationship between the public and its government. Journalists pressed harder. Citizens questioned more deeply. Future administrations faced greater scrutiny. Vietnam became more than a conflict overseas. It became a turning point in how Americans process power. Some still argue that the original goal, stopping the spread of communism, was strategically necessary in the Cold War environment. Others believe the cost outweighed the premise from the start. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing. The war fractured confidence. And once confidence fractures, it rarely returns to its original shape. The final American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973. Saigon fell in 1975. Images of helicopters lifting from rooftops became symbols, not just of withdrawal, but of unfinished resolution. For many veterans, the return home was quieter than previous wars. Complex, sometimes misunderstood. They had carried out their missions with discipline and loyalty, yet the nation they returned to was divided over the war that sent them. That distinction matters, because the truth arriving late doesn't erase sacrifice. It complicates memory, and history rarely offers clean endings. So what was the Cold War lie? Was it a deliberate fabrication? A rushed interpretation? A fear-driven decision amplified into certainty? The answer depends on perspective, and perspective depends on what weight you assign to uncertainty in moments of crisis. But here's the lasting impact. Vietnam forced America to confront the gap between belief and reality. It forced a generation to ask harder questions about intelligence, about executive power, about how fear shapes policy, about how narratives are formed. And that conversation did not end in 1975. It echoes in every major foreign policy decision since. Because once a nation experiences the cost of acting on incomplete certainty, it never evaluates future conflicts the same way again. History is not just about what happened. It's about what was believed at the time and what was learned later. If this breakdown helped you see Vietnam from a deeper perspective, beyond headlines and slogans, make sure you subscribe for more historical deep dives like this. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Vietnam an unavoidable Cold War battleground, or a war built on momentum and miscalculation? The debate continues, and understanding it still matters.